context, my husband said running the house was the bare minimum a Roomba could handle. So I got a job and left him to do everything until he accidentally sent our daughter to school with his mom's prescription narcotics instead of her lunch and got us investigated by child services while she became known as the substance girl, and he nearly lost his job and our kids because he couldn't even remember to pay the electric bill. My husband Mark has always said that me taking care of the whole house was the bare minimum. Cooking, cleaning, laundry, homework help, school lunches, driving to practice, making beds, grocery shopping, literally everything except his job was apparently a piece of cake. He'd walk in at 2:05 and plant himself in front of the TV with a beer by 11:05 while I hadn't stopped moving since dawn and wouldn't till bedtime. Thing is, it never even bothered me until I started paying attention to what Mark really thought of me. It was always just little comments at dinner I dismissed, like when our daughter Nice talked about her friend's mom, who is a surgeon, and Mark would say, "Now that's a real career," while looking directly at me, or when Mark would introduce me at his company events and when asked what I do for work, he'd say, "She's just a housewife." The more I thought about it, the angrier I became. He'd walk past me scrubbing toilets and sarcastically say, "Rough life." At parent-teacher conferences, he'd interrupt me to translate what the teacher means to me, like I was too stupid to understand English. When the washing machine broke and I fixed it using YouTube, he told his friends, "I got lucky pressing buttons." He'd FaceTime his mom while I cooked dinner and pan the camera over me saying, "Look, Mom, Jenny's pretending to be busy again." When I organized our taxes, receipts, and bills every year, he joked that even monkeys can sort papers. When our neighbors noticed how exhausted I seemed and suggested to Mark that I could use some help, he said that hiring a maid would be pointless since Jenny barely does anything a Roomba couldn't handle. The more I thought about it, the angrier I became. And then during one family dinner, I hit my boiling point. Mark's brother was visiting, and Mark was going on about his latest promotion, which I was super happy about BTW. His brother asked what I'd been up to after hearing Mark's monologue. I actually got excited. Nobody really asked me what I was up to. I went to answer, but before I could, Mark jumped in with, "Oh, you know my Jenny, she doesn't do a whole lot. Deciding between paper and plastic straws is probably her biggest decision of the day." Everyone laughed, even my kids laughed. I sat there cutting my chicken and realized something changed inside me. That night, I updated my resume for the first time in 12 years. I'd been a marketing director before Eunice was born, but Mark had insisted one of us should stay home. Well, now I applied to 5 jobs, and pretty soon, I got an offer from a tech startup. The salary was 12.5 less than Mark's, but I accepted it immediately. Sunday night before my Monday start date, I made a nice dinner, pot roast, which was Mark's favorite. And as we ate, I mentioned casually that I'd gotten a job and would be starting tomorrow. Mark chuckled like I was a comedian. Right, doing what exactly? I explained to him about the marketing position and watched his face change. Kids looked confused, like they couldn't process Mom doing anything outside the house. "You can't be serious," Mark said. "Who's going to handle everything here? The kids have practice, and Nice has her recital coming up, and my mother needs her prescriptions picked up every week, and I'm sure you'll figure it out," I said, taking another bite of pot roast. The next morning, I left at 4:05 a.m. sharp. Mark was scrambling trying to figure out coffee maker. Eunice was yelling about not having clean volleyball shorts. Chris couldn't find his science textbook. I grabbed my purse and my travel mug and walked out the door. My first week was incredible. I'd forgotten how good it felt to use my brain for something beyond familial planning. My coworkers treated me like an actual person with thoughts and ideas. Meanwhile, my phone was blowing up. Mark missed an important client meeting because he had to pick up Chris from school. Eunice had to wear dirty gym clothes. They ate takeout 4 nights in a row. By week 2, Mark was begging me to quit. "This isn't working, Jenny. The house is a disaster. I can't manage my job and all this other stuff." "Other stuff?" I asked. "You mean the bare minimum?" Month 1 ended with Mark gaining 12 lbs from fast food and his boss pulling him aside about his sudden performance issues. Kids were constantly complaining. Eunice missed her recital because Mark forgot to put it in his calendar. Chris failed a test because no one helped him study. By month 3, Mark's life was in shambles. His brother came for Thanksgiving and couldn't believe the state of the house. Dishes piled up, laundry everywhere. Mark looked exhausted with bags under his eyes. His brother actually said, "Dude, what happened to Mr. I Make the Money?" I had to hide my smile behind my wine glass. Month 4 brought the breaking point. Mark's company announced layoffs. He called me sobbing from his car. "Jenny, I can't lose this job. Not now. Not when I can barely function. Please, I'm sorry. I had no idea what you did. I'm drowning here." I agreed to help him through the layoff scare, but told him things would be different. He had to start picking weight up around the house. He agreed no text before I even finished my sentence. 1 week later, I got got promoted. Things were honestly running pretty smoothly both at work and at home. But then while I was at work, someone knocked on my office door. "Your husband called 6 times about some emergency with your daughter's school." I looked at my phone. 39 missed calls, 12 from the school, a voicemail from the police. Mark's last text read, "Jenny, please call me back. I think I really messed up." Like legal trouble messed up. My assistant added, "There's also a woman here claiming to be your mother-in-law's lawyer." I rushed out of the office, my heart pounding as I fumbled with my car keys. The drive to Eunice's school felt like an eternity, even though I made it in 17 minutes flat. Police cars lined the parking lot, their lights flashing against the brick building. Parents clustered in worried groups near the entrance. Mark stood by the principal's office door, his face pale and sweaty. He grabbed my arm the moment he saw me. His hands trembled as he pulled me aside, away from the other parents. The principal emerged from her office, her expression stern. She motioned for us to follow her inside. The small room felt suffocating with Mark, me, principal, and 2 police officers all crammed together. One officer held a plastic evidence bag containing what looked like prescription bottles. Mark shifted nervously in his chair as the principal explained. Apparently, he'd been picking up his mother's prescriptions that morning and left the bag in the car. When he dropped Eunice off late, she'd grabbed what she thought was her lunch bag. Instead, she'd brought a bag full of controlled substances into school. The situation escalated when Eunice, confused about why her lunch looked different, showed the bottles to her teacher. The teacher immediately called the office. The school went into lockdown. Police were called. Substance-sniffing dogs swept the building. I watched Mark sink lower in his chair as the officers explained the severity of bringing prescription narcotics onto school property, even accidentally. They mentioned words like endangerment and negligence and investigation. My stomach turned. The principal informed us that Eunice was traumatized. She'd been questioned by police, removed from class in front of everyone, and was now sitting in the nurse's office crying. Other parents were demanding answers. The school board would need to meet about this incident. After an hour of questioning and paperwork, the officers decided not to arrest Mark, but warned this would be thoroughly investigated. We'd need to attend mandatory meetings with child services. The school was considering suspension for Eunice, even though she'd done nothing wrong. I found Eunice in the nurse's office, her face red and puffy from crying. She wouldn't even look at Mark. On the drive home, she sat in the back seat, arms crossed, staring out the window. Mark tried to apologize, but she just turned her music up louder. At home, Chris was already there, having walked from his school. News traveled fast in our district. He glared at Mark with a mixture of anger and disappointment. Apparently, kids were already texting about Eunice being the substance girl. My phone buzzed constantly. Other parents wanting to know what happened. My boss texting about whether I'd be back today. The school counselor scheduling mandatory sessions. Mark's mother calling repeatedly, confused about why her prescriptions were at the police station. Mark paced the living room, running his hands through his hair. He kept muttering about how this wasn't his fault, how anyone could have made this mistake. But I noticed he couldn't meet my eyes. The doorbell rang. Mark's mother stood there with a woman in a sharp, disciplinary action. I excused myself to check on the kids. Eunice had locked herself in her room. Through the door, I could hear her on the phone with friends, trying to explain what happened. Her voice cracked as she insisted she didn't know what was in the bag. Chris sat at the kitchen table, homework spread out but untouched. He looked up when I entered. His expression was serious, older than his years. He asked if we were getting divorced. The question hit me like a punch to the gut. I returned to find the lawyer explaining potential consequences. The school could pursue expulsion. Child Protective Services would definitely investigate. Marka might face criminal charges depending on the investigation's outcome. Our family would be under scrutiny for months. Mark really went from Jenny barely does anything a Roomba couldn't handle to accidentally turning their daughter into the school's most infamous lunch breer in record time. Mark's mother kept insisting this was all a misunderstanding, that her son was a good father, but I caught her giving Mark disappointed looks when she thought no one was watching. She'd warned him about being careless with her medications before. The lawyer left with a retainer check and a promise to contact the school's administration. Mark's mother followed soon after, but not before pulling me aside. She whispered that she'd been telling Mark for months he needed to step up. She'd seen how overwhelmed he was. That evening, nobody wanted dinner. Eunice refused to come out of her room. Chris picked out a sandwich before retreating to play video games. Mark sat at the kitchen table, laptop open, frantically researching legal precedents for accidental substance possession on school property. I tried to focus on work emails, but concentration was impossible. My promotion celebration now felt like a lifetime ago. Everything we'd built, the stability I'd worked so hard to achieve, threatened to crumble because of one careless mistake. The school called again. The emergency board meeting was scheduled for tomorrow morning. We'd need to appear and explain ourselves. Other parents were demanding Eunice be removed from school activities until the investigation concluded. Her volleyball season might be over. Mark finally broke down around 15:05 that night. He sat on the couch, head in his hands, shoulders shaking. He admitted he'd been so focused on proving he could handle everything that he'd been cutting corners, leaving things in the car, forgetting appointments, making dangerous mistakes. But his admission felt hollow. The damage was done. Eunice's reputation at school was shattered. The family was under investigation. My new job, which had no text been going so well, now had this cloud hanging over it. My coworkers would whisper about the woman whose family brought substances to school. I spent the night making lists, lawyers to call, documents to gather, character references to contact. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here I was handling another crisis, managing another mess because Mark couldn't handle the bare minimum of family responsibilities. By morning, I had a plan. We'd fight the school's disciplinary action, cooperate fully with the investigation, get Eunice into counseling to deal with the trauma, but things would have to change dramatically at home. Mark's period of struggling through was over. Professionals, help, household systems, whatever it took. The emergency board meeting was scheduled for 13:05 a.m. I dressed carefully and professionally. Mark wore his best suit, but it hung loose on his frame from all the weight he'd lost. Eunice refused to go, so we arranged for her to stay with my sister. The meeting room was packed. Other parents filled the seats, their faces a mix of concern and judgment. I recognized several from PTA meetings where I'd organized fundraisers and events. Now they looked at us like we were dangerous strangers. The board president called the meeting to order. What followed was an hour of heated discussion about school safety, zero-tolerance policies, and the message this sent to other students. Parents stood up one by one, expressing their fears and demanding action. Mark tried to explain, his voice shaking. He outlined the morning's chaos, his mother's medical needs, and the honest mistake, but his words fell flat against the wall of parental anger. Someone mentioned calling local news stations. Another suggested a petition to ban our family from school property. I finally stood up. My voice was steady as I reminded them of my years of volunteer service, fundraisers I'd organized, classroom parties I'd hosted. I asked them to consider the trauma already inflicted on an innocent child who'd done nothing wrong except grab the wrong bag. The room fell silent. A few parents looked uncomfortable, remembering the times I'd helped their children or supported their causes. But the damage to our reputation was clear. Even if Eunice stayed in school, she'd carry the stigma. Kids could be cruel, and parents could be worse. After the meeting, we sat in the car in silence. Mark stared at the steering wheel, looking defeated. I thought about all those dinners where he'd minimized my contributions, all those times he'd called my work the bare minimum. Now, he couldn't even manage that without creating a crisis that threatened everything. My phone buzzed with a text from my boss. She was understanding, but concerned. This kind of family drama could affect my performance, my reputation at company. The promotion I'd worked so hard for suddenly felt precarious. One family crisis bleeding into my professional life. We drove home to find reporters from the local paper parked outside. Apparently, someone from the meeting had called them substance. Scare at local elementary would make a compelling headline. Mark ducked inside while I politely declined to comment. Inside, Chris was stress-eating cereal from the box while playing video games. He'd skipped school, too embarrassed to face questions about his sister. The house felt like a bunker, all of us hiding from the outside world and from each other. I realized then that Mark's inability to handle basic household management had created a cascading failure. One mistake with a prescription bag had unraveled months of progress. My job, the kids' stability, our family's reputation, all hanging by a thread because he couldn't keep track of simple things. The lawyer called with updates. The police investigation would take weeks. Child services would start home visits soon. The school board would vote on disciplinary action at next month's regular meeting. In the meantime, Eunice would attend classes under a safety plan that felt more like punishment. That night, I lay awake thinking about how we'd gotten here. From Mark mocking my contributions to him nearly destroying our family through sheer incompetence. The man who thought running a household was beneath him had proven he couldn't even do it safely. The next morning brought fresh challenges. Eunice's volleyball coach called to say she was benched pending investigation. Her grades were slipping from the stress. Chris was acting out, getting into arguments with teachers. The family was fracturing under the pressure of Mark's mistake. I threw myself into damage control. Meetings with lawyers, school administrators, and counselors filled my days. My understanding boss granted me flexibility, but I knew her patience wasn't infinite. The promotion I'd earned was slipping away as I dealt with another family crisis. Mark, meanwhile, seemed paralyzed. He went through the motions of his job, but came home defeated each day. He'd started seeing the household responsibilities he'd mocked as insurmountable obstacles. The confident man who belittled my work was gone, replaced by someone overwhelmed by laundry and meal planning. 0 weeks into the crisis, child services made their first home visit. They inspected everything, asked probing questions, and took notes on their tablets. tablets. They interviewed each child separately. Eunice cried through her interview. Chris was sullen and uncooperative. Mark stammered through his explanations. The investigator's report would determine whether we kept our family intact. The weight of that possibility hung over every interaction. Simple conversations became tense negotiations. Family dinners were silent affairs. Each of us lost in our own fears about what might happen next. I found myself doing what I'd always done, managing everything. But now it felt different. This wasn't about proving my worth or gaining respect. This was about survival, keeping our family from completely imploding because Mark couldn't handle basic responsibilities he'd dismissed as trivial. The irony was bitter. All those no-text years of him calling my work the bare minimum, and he couldn't even meet that bar without endangering our children and destroying our reputation. The man who thought I did nothing had proven that doing it all required skills he simply didn't possess. As another sleepless night stretched toward dawn, I wondered if we'd ever recover from this. The investigation would eventually end, but the damage to our family might be permanent. Trust, once broken, was hard to rebuild, and Mark had shattered. More than just trust, he'd destroyed the very foundation of our children's security. Tomorrow would bring more meetings, more damage control, more attempts to piece together what Mark's carelessness had broken. The bare minimum had never felt so impossibly hard to achieve. The morning after my sleepless night, I woke to find Mark already gone. A sticky note on the coffee maker read that he'd left early to meet with his boss about the performance issues. I got the kids ready, no text, in silence. Eunice barely touching her breakfast, while Chris kept his headphones on the entire time. At work, my team had prepared for our quarterly presentation to the board. I'd been leading this project for weeks, and it represented everything I'd accomplished since my promotion. But as I reviewed my slides one last time, my assistant knocked urgently. Mark was in the lobby, insisting he needed to speak with me about a family emergency. I found him pacing near the security desk, disheveled and frantic. He grabbed my shoulders the moment he saw me, explaining that child services had called about an immediate home inspection. They'd received an anonymous tip about neglect and wanted to investigate within the hour. My presentation was in 35 minutes. My boss appeared in the lobby, having heard about the commotion. She looked between Mark and me with concern. I explained the situation briefly, watching her expression shift from sympathetic to worried. She reminded me that the board presentation couldn't be rescheduled, that the entire quarter's strategy depended on it. Mark insisted I had to come immediately, that the investigator specifically requested both parents present. Mark's timing with emergencies is truly chef's kiss perfect. Nothing says I support your career like dragging your wife out of a board presentation for the mess he created in the first place. He kept checking his phone, showing me missed calls from an unknown number. His hands shook as he scrolled through the messages. I made a decision that felt like choosing between two impossible options. I handed my presentation materials to my assistant, quickly explaining the key points. She looked terrified, but nodded. Then I followed Mark to the parking lot, my heels clicking against the pavement as we rushed to his car. The drive home revealed more problems. Mark admitted he'd forgotten to pay the electricity bill, and our power had been shut off that morning. He'd been trying to get it restored before the inspection. The no-text house was not only without power, but still in the chaotic state from the previous weeks of crisis. We arrived to find a child services investigator already parked outside. She stood on our porch, clipboard in hand, checking her watch. Mark fumbled with his keys while I mentally cataloged everything wrong inside our dark, disheveled home. The investigator introduced herself as Ms. McDaniel, her expression professionally neutral as she explained the nature of the complaint. Someone had reported that our children were living in squalor, that they had been coming to school unkempt and unfed. She needed to verify their living conditions immediately. Inside, the house told its own story. Dishes overflowed the sink, laundry created mountains in every room. The refrigerator, without power, had started to smell. Trash bags lined the hallway where Mark had started cleaning, but never finished. Ms. McDaniel took photos of everything. Mark attempted to explain about our situation, how it was just a missed payment, not neglect. But his explanation sounded hollow as we stood in the dim light filtering through dirty windows. I watched him spiral, making excuses that only made things worse. I took charge, showing Ms. to McDaniel the children's rooms, which I'd managed to keep relatively clean despite everything. I produced medical records, school reports, anything to prove we were caring for our kids. She took notes but remained expressionless. The inspection lasted 7 hours. She examined everything from our food supplies to the children's clothing. She asked about our daily routines, work schedules, and childcare arrangements. Mark kept interrupting, with defensive comments that made us look worse. My phone buzzed constantly throughout. Messages from my assistant about presentation disaster, my boss asking where I was, colleagues wondering if I was okay. Each notification felt like another nail in the coffin of my career. After Ms. McDaniel left with promises to follow up within 53 hours. Mark collapsed on the couch. He blamed me for not being home to manage things, for prioritizing work over family. The irony of his accusation after years of dismissing my household work wasn't lost on me. I spent the afternoon in crisis mode. First, getting the power restored, which required paying not just the overdue bill, but also a reconnection fee. Then, tackling the house systematically, room by room. Mark sat at the kitchen table, supposedly helping, but mostly just moving things from one pile to another. The school called around 05. Eunice had broken down in class, sobbing uncontrollably. Counselors suggested she might benefit from coming home early. I left Mark with cleaning instructions and drove to get her, finding my daughter curled up in the nurse's office. On the drive home, Eunice finally opened up. Kids were calling her names, saying her family was trash, that her dad was a substance dealer. Someone had started a rumor that child services was going to take her away. She begged me to homeschool her, to let her hide until everyone forgot. Back home, I found Mark on the phone with his mother. He was asking her to write a character reference for the child services investigation. Through the conversation, I learned she'd been telling her friends about our situation, and word had spread through their entire social circle. That evening, while making dinner with our newly restored power, I discovered more of Mark's failures. Bills hidden in drawers, unopened, permission slips for school events never signed, a notice from Chris's teacher about multiple missing assignments. The bare minimum had become an impossible mountain. My boss called during dinner. The board presentation had been a disaster. My assistant had tried her best, but without my expertise, critical questions went unanswered. The quarterly strategy was now in jeopardy. She needed me in the office early tomorrow for damage control. Mark overheard the conversation and immediately started planning how I could take time off to handle the house. He suggested I use my sick days, maybe work part-time until things stabilized. He couldn't see how his inability to manage basic tasks was destroying everything I'd worked for. The next morning arrived with new chaos. Chris refused to go to school, claiming a stomachache. Eunice moved like a ghost, barely speaking. Mark had an important client meeting he couldn't miss. I stood in the kitchen, pulled in every direction, watching my carefully rebuilt life unravel. I made another impossible choice. I called my sister to watch Chris and drove Eunice to school myself, walking her to class to ensure she went. Then, I headed to the office, arriving late to find my team in crisis mode, trying to salvage quarterly projections. The day blurred between spreadsheets and worried texts from home. My sister reported that Chris had spent the morning crying. Eunice's teacher emailed about her lack of focus. Mark sent panicked messages about child services calling again. During lunch, I sat in my car and called the child services investigator. Ms. McDaniel explained that they'd received additional complaints. Someone had reported seeing our children walking to school alone in dirty clothes. The investigation was escalating. I thought about who might be making these reports. The timing seemed too convenient, too targeted. Then I remembered Mark's comments about some neighbors who'd been cold lately. Had our family drama become neighborhood entertainment? That afternoon, my boss called me into her office. She expressed sympathy for my situation, but reminded me that my performance was suffering. The promotion I'd earned was contingent on maintaining high standards. If I couldn't manage my responsibilities, they'd need to reconsider. I left work early again, finding Mark at home surrounded by cleaning supplies, but having accomplished nothing. He'd spent the day researching child services procedures online, convincing himself we were going to lose the kids. His panic was making everything worse. The house phone rang, Mark's mother on the line. She informed us that she'd hired a family advocate to help with the investigation. She also mentioned almost casually that she'd been documenting everything for months. Every time Mark called her for help, every crisis he'd created, her documentation painted a damning picture. Mark's inability to manage school pickups, forgotten appointments, the kids calling her crying because dad forgot to make dinner. She'd kept it all thinking she was helping, but now it looked like evidence against us. I spent that evening creating my own documentation, receipts showing I'd maintained the household finances, school records from when I was the primary caregiver, character references from teachers who'd worked with me for years. Building a defense felt surreal. Eunice emerged from her room around 13, asking if we were going to lose our house. The question broke my heart. I assured her we weren't, but doubt crept into my voice. Between the investigation costs, the lawyer fees, and my jeopardized job, our financial stability was crumbling. Mark found me organizing papers at midnight. He attempted to help, but quickly became overwhelmed by the complexity of our situation. He suggested again that I should quit my job, focus on fixing things. He still didn't understand that my income was now essential. The next day brought the second child services visit. Ms. McDaniel arrived with colleague, their inspection more thorough than before. They interviewed each child separately in their rooms while Mark and I waited in the living room, forbidden from interrupting. Chris's interview lasted 45 minutes. We could hear his muffled voice through the door, but couldn't make out words. Eunice was shorter, but no text ended with her in tears. The investigators took more photos, made more notes, their expressions revealing nothing. After they left, the kids were withdrawn and scared. Eunice whispered that they'd asked if she felt safe at home, if anyone hurt her. Chris said they wanted to know about meals, homework help, and why he'd been missing school. Normal questions that felt invasive given our circumstances. My phone rang with another work crisis. A major client was threatening to pull out because because of the botched presentation. My team needed me there immediately, but Mark had a mandatory meeting with HR about his performance issues, and someone had to be home with kids. I called in the only reinforcement I had left, my mother. She lived 0 hours away, but dropped everything to come help. While waiting for her arrival, I fielded calls from work, trying to salvage the client relationship remotely. Mark returned from his meeting looking defeated. He'd been put on a performance improvement plan. One more mistake, and he'd be terminated. The man who'd once mocked my contributions now faced losing the job he'd prioritized over everything else. My mother arrived to find chaos. She took one look at the situation and started organizing with military precision. She sent Mark to grocery shop with a detailed list. She set Chris up with his homework. She sat with Eunice, letting her talk about school troubles. I escaped to the office, finding my team frantically preparing for the emergency client meeting. We had 7 hours to create a presentation that would save $1 million account. Power outage during a child services visit. That's definitely going to look great on the inspection report. Nothing says stable home environment like conducting interviews. By candlelight while your fridge slowly turns into a science experiment. My assistant had prepared materials, but the strategy needed my expertise. The meeting was brutal. The client questioned every projection, every strategy point. They referenced the disastrous board presentation, wondering if our company could still deliver. I fought for every point, drawing on years of experience to rebuild their confidence. We saved the account, barely, but the victory felt hollow when I checked my phone to find multiple missed calls from home. Mark had forgotten to pick up his mother's prescriptions again. The pharmacy was closed. She needed her medication tonight. I called every pharmacy in town until I found a 29-hour location that could fill an emergency prescription. Then, I raced there before heading home, adding another task to my endless list. The bare minimum had become a crushing weight. At home, I found my mother had worked miracles. The house was cleaner, the kids were calm, and dinner was ready, but she pulled me aside with concerns. Mark seemed incapable of following simple instructions. He'd bought the wrong groceries, forgotten half the items, and spent the budget on expensive pre-made foods. That night, my mother offered to stay for a week to help. I wanted to refuse to prove I could handle it, but reality won. We needed help. Mark's incompetence had created a crisis that threatened to destroy everything we'd built. The next morning brought new complications. The school called about Eunice's attendance. She'd been marked absent from 3 classes despite being dropped off. They'd found her hiding in the bathroom, too anxious to face her classmates. I left another important meeting to handle the situation. The school counselor recommended immediate therapy. The principal suggested Eunice might benefit from transferring to their alternative program for students in crisis. My straight-A daughter was being labeled as troubled. Meanwhile, Mark texted that Child Services had called about scheduling a family assessment. We'd need to meet with a psychologist who would evaluate our family dynamics. The investigation was expanding beyond simple home visits. I sat in the school parking lot making phone calls to arrange therapy, update our lawyer, and reschedule work meetings. Each call felt like admitting defeat. The life I'd carefully built was crumbling because Mark couldn't handle basic responsibilities. My boss texted asking about my availability for a conference next week. It was a crucial networking opportunity, a chance to establish partnerships that would secure my position. But it would mean 3 days, no text away from home during the investigation. That evening, I found Mark attempting to help Chris with homework, but he was teaching math incorrectly, confusing our son more. When I gently corrected him, he exploded, accusing me of undermining him. Chris fled to his room in tears. My mother intervened, sending Mark to cool off while she comforted Chris. She later told me she'd never seen Mark like this, desperate and defensive. She worried about his mental state, suggested he might need professional help too. The family assessment was scheduled for Friday. We spent the week preparing, trying to present a united front, but every interaction revealed more cracks. Mark couldn't remember basic details about kids' schedules. He mixed up their teachers' names, their friends, their interests. The morning of the assessment, Eunice refused to leave her room. She'd developed stress hives and was scratching until she bled. Chris had wet the bed for the first time in years. Our family was literally falling apart from the pressure. The psychologist, Dr. O'Daniel, arrived precisely on time. She observed our family interactions, asked probing questions, and took extensive notes. Mark tried too hard to appear competent, making obvious mistakes that she definitely noticed. During individual interviews, I could hear Mark's nervous laughter through the walls. He was overcompensating, probably making things worse. The kids were withdrawn, giving short answers. The entire assessment felt like watching our family through a stranger's critical lens. Dr. O'Daniel left with promises to submit her report within a week. Her expression gave nothing away, but I caught her looking at Mark with something like concern. Or was it pity? I couldn't tell which was worse. That weekend, my mother returned home, unable to extend her stay. She left me with a hug and a warning that something needed to change dramatically. She'd seen how Mark operated or failed to operate and worried about our future. Monday arrived with an email that made my blood run cold. The school board had voted. While Eunice could remain enrolled, she was banned from all extracurricular extracurricular activities pending the investigation's conclusion. No volleyball, no clubs, no normal teenage life. I watched my daughter read the email, saw something break inside her. She'd worked so hard for her spot on the volleyball team. Now it was gone because her father couldn't keep track of a prescription bag. The unfairness of it all was crushing. Mark's response was to blame the school, the system, everyone but himself. He ranted about unfair treatment while I made calls to appeal the decision, but I knew it was futile. The damage to our reputation was too severe. My work suffered as I juggled crisis management, projects fell behind, meetings were rescheduled, my team tried to cover, but my absence was noticeable. The promotion I'd earned was slipping away, replaced by whispers about my complicated home life. Then came the letter from Child Services. The investigation was moving to the next phase. They required psychological evaluations for both parents, parenting classes, and regular check-ins. Failure to comply would result in formal proceedings. I stared at the letter, thinking about how we'd gotten here. From Mark belittling my work to him destroying our family through incompetence, the man who thought household management was beneath him had proven he couldn't even do it safely. That night, I made a decision. I called our lawyer and asked about separation procedures. Not divorce, not yet. But something had to change. Mark's inability to function as an adult was dragging us all down. The kids needed stability I couldn't provide while managing his failures. The lawyer explained the complications. With an active child services investigation, any major changes could be seen negatively. We were trapped in a failing dynamic, unable to fix it without risking everything. The system meant to protect was now imprisoning us. I found Mark in the garage, attempting to organize tools he'd never used. He looked up when I entered, his face showing the strain of recent weeks. For a moment, I saw the man I'd married before. Arrogance and incompetence revealed his true nature. We talked for hours that night, not arguing, just talking about how we'd gotten here, about what needed to change, about whether our marriage could survive his inability to handle the responsibilities. He'd mocked for so long, Mark finally admitted the truth. He'd never learned basic life skills. His mother had done everything than I had. He'd coasted through life believing household management was simple because someone else always handled it. Now faced with reality, he was drowning. But admission wasn't enough. The investigation continued. The damage to our children persisted. My career hung by a thread, and Mark's newfound awareness didn't magically grant him competence. We were still in crisis, just with more self-awareness. The next morning brought another emergency. Chris's teacher called about a disturbing essay he'd written about his home life. Nothing that suggested abuse, but enough concern to warrant intervention. Another report to Child Services, another mark against us. I sat in my car after that call, wondering if we'd ever escape this spiral. Every attempt to fix one problem created two more. Mark's initial mistake had created an avalanche that buried our entire family. The bare minimum had become an impossible standard. As I drove to work late again, I thought about the irony. All those years of Mark dismissing my contributions, and now his inability to match them was destroying everything. The man who thought I did nothing had proven that doing it all required skills, dedication, and competence he simply didn't possess. The truth was bitter, but clear. Mark hadn't just failed to handle the bare minimum, he'd failed our family in ways that might be irreparable, and I was left picking up the pieces, trying to salvage what remained of the life we'd built, while he struggled with tasks he'd once mocked as simple. Tomorrow would bring the psychological evaluation results, the child services recommendations, more meetings, more crisis management, more attempts to hold together a family that Mark's incompetence had shattered. The bare minimum had never seemed so impossibly out of reach. The psychological evaluation results arrived 0 days later in a thick envelope. I opened it with trembling hands while Mark hovered nearby, wringing his hands. Dr. O'Daniel's report was thorough and damning. She noted Mark's inability to recall basic information about his children's lives, his defensive responses to simple questions, and most concerning, his apparent lack of understanding about household management despite months of supposed effort. My evaluation was different. She'd noted my organizational skills, my clear, no-text knowledge of the children's needs, and my ability to maintain structure despite crisis. But she also expressed concern about my stress levels and the sustainability of managing everything alone. The recommendation was clear: intensive parenting classes for Mark, continued monitoring, and family therapy. Mark grabbed the papers from me, scanning them frantically. His face went from pale to red as he read. He crumpled the pages, then smoothed them out again, as if changing their physical form might alter the words. I watched him pace the kitchen, muttering about biased evaluators and unfair assessments. The next morning, I woke to find Mark already dressed in his best suit. He'd made breakfast, burnt eggs, and soggy toast, but the effort was there. He announced he was taking the day off to handle everything. I should go to work without worry. The determination in his voice almost made me believe him. At the office, I tried to focus on the partnership proposals that could save my position. My team had worked overtime to prepare materials after the client crisis, but concentration proved impossible when Eunice's school called. called. She'd had a panic attack during PE and was in the nurse's office. I found my daughter curled in a chair, her breathing shallow and rapid. The nurse explained that some girls had been taunting her about the substance incident. They'd formed a circle around her, chanting about her criminal family. Eunice had collapsed, hyperventilating. The principal appeared, suggesting we consider the alternative program more seriously. Regular classes were proving too stressful for Eunice. She handed me brochures about their Fresh Start initiative for students facing challenges. My straight-A daughter reduced to a program for troubled kids. I drove Eunice home in silence. She stared out the window, occasionally wiping tears. At a red light, she finally spoke, asking if we could move somewhere new, start over where nobody knew about the prescription bag incident. The pain in her voice was devastating. At home, I found chaos. Mark had attempted to clean, but had mixed cleaning chemicals, creating toxic fumes. Windows were open, fans running. Chris sat outside on the porch, his homework scattered by wind. Mark emerged from the bathroom, coughing and eyes watering. He'd also attempted laundry, mixing colors with whites, shrinking Chris's school uniforms. The kitchen showed evidence of his lunch attempt. A grease fire had left black marks on the ceiling. He'd ordered pizza instead. The boxes stacked on the counter. My mother called while I surveyed the damage. She'd heard from Mark's mother about the evaluation results. The two grandmothers had been talking, comparing notes. She offered to move in temporarily to provide stability during the investigation. I wanted to accept, but knew it would look like we couldn't manage. That evening, Mark announced he'd enrolled in the required parenting classes. They started next week, 3 nights plus Saturdays. He showed me the schedule proudly, not realizing it conflicted with Chris's basketball games and UniCE's therapy appointments. I know Tex spent hours rearranging schedules, calling in favors for carpools, negotiating with my boss for flexible hours. Each accommodation felt like another step backward in my career. The conference next week loomed, but attending seemed impossible. The doorbell rang after dinner. Our elderly neighbor stood there with a casserole and a concerned expression. She had noticed the police visits, the social workers, the stress on the children's faces. She offered to help however she could, mentioning she'd raised 5 kids herself. Her kindness broke something in me. I accepted the casserole with shaking hands, fighting back tears. She patted my arm, whispering that she'd seen Mark's struggles with basic tasks. The whole neighborhood had noticed our family falling apart. Mark found me crying in the bathroom afterward. He tried to comfort me, but his touch felt hollow. He promised things would get better once he finished classes, learned the systems, but we both knew the damage went deeper than scheduling and household management. The next day brought the first parenting class. I drove Mark there, watching him trudge inside with other parents who'd failed in various ways. The instructor greeted them with professional cheerfulness that didn't mask the serious nature of their gathering. While Mark attended class, I took the kids for ice cream. Chris picked at his sundae, finally admitting kids at school were avoiding him. Parents had warned their children about associating with our family. He'd eaten lunch alone for weeks. Eunice added that her former friends had created a group chat specifically to exclude her. Screenshots of their cruel messages had circulated. She showed me one calling her father a substance dealer, another suggesting she probably used too. No text, teenage cruelty amplified by parental fears. I dropped them at home and returned to pick up Mark. He emerged from the class looking shell-shocked. The instructor had covered basic child development, and he'd realized how little he knew about his own children's needs. The other parents had shared their failures, and Mark had recognized himself in their stories. On the drive home, he tried to process what he'd learned. They discussed emotional availability, consistent routines, and active engagement, concepts I'd lived for years, but that seemed foreign to him. He pulled out a workbook, pages of exercises about understanding your child's perspective. That weekend, Child Services made another visit. Ms. McDaniel noted improvements in the house's condition, but remained concerned about the family's emotional state. She interviewed the children again, their answers reflecting the ongoing stress despite our efforts. She pulled me aside afterward, speaking more candidly than before. The investigation would continue for at least 3 more months. Any negative reports could escalate to formal proceedings. She suggested I document everything, especially Mark's participation in required programs. I spent Sunday creating detailed logs while Mark attempted to implement his class lessons. He tried engaging with Chris about basketball, but his forced enthusiasm felt awkward. He attempted to help Eunice with homework, but quickly became frustrated with material he didn't understand. Monday arrived with an email that made my stomach drop. The conference had been moved up. I needed to leave tomorrow for 0 days. Missing. It would effectively end my advancement opportunities, but leaving during the investigation felt like abandoning my family. I called my mother, then Mark's mother, trying to arrange coverage. Both could help, but worried about Mark's ability to coordinate their assistance. Simple tasks like school, pickup times, and medication schedules seemed beyond his capability to communicate clearly. That evening, I created detailed schedules, emergency contact lists, and meal plans, everything color-coded and posted throughout the house. Mark watched me work, promising he could handle 0 days. His confidence felt forced. The kids' reactions were mixed. Chris worried about Dad remembering basketball practice. Eunice asked if Grandma could just handle everything instead. Neither trusted Mark to manage without crisis, and I couldn't blame them. I made my decision. The conference was crucial for our financial stability. Without my job, we'd lose everything. I booked my flight, arranged grandmother coverage, and prepared for 0 days away. Mark would have to step up or fail definitively. The morning of departure, I left before dawn. Mark was already up, studying my schedules with intense focus. He'd set multiple alarms, laid out the kids' clothes, and prepared breakfast ingredients. The effort was touching, even if execution remained uncertain. At the airport, I fielded anxious texts from Mark about lunch money locations and permission slip deadlines. Each question revealed how little he'd absorbed despite months of crisis. I answered patiently while boarding, knowing communication would be limited once airborne. The conference began with networking sessions I'd anticipated for months. Industry leaders discussed partnerships that could transform our company's trajectory. I forced myself to focus, to present the professional image I'd cultivated despite personal chaos. Between sessions, I checked my phone. 21 missed calls, texts from both grandmothers about confusion over schedules, a voicemail from school about Chris arriving late, another from Nice, crying about forgotten therapy appointments. I excused myself from a crucial dinner to handle crisis management via phone. Mark had mixed up the grandmother's schedules, sending both to pick up kids simultaneously. They'd argued in the school parking lot while the children waited, embarrassed. The second day brought worse news. Mark had forgotten to give Eunice her anxiety medication. She'd had another panic attack at school. The counselor was recommending immediate psychiatric evaluation. Child services had been notified of the medical neglect. I sat in my hotel room, weighing options. Flying home would end my career advancement. Staying meant risking escalation with child services. I called our lawyer, who advised documentation but cautioned against abandoning professional obligations. The final conference day included my presentation on strategic partnerships. I delivered it flawlessly while my phone buzzed with incoming disasters. My professional mask never slipped, even as my personal life crumbled via text message. The UPS flight home felt endless. I'd secured 2 major partnerships and impressed senior leadership. But success felt hollow, knowing what awaited. Mark's final text had been ominous. "We need to talk," made things worse. "So sorry." I found my family in various states of distress. Eunice locked in her room, Chris playing video games with empty food containers surrounding him, Mark sitting at the kitchen table with official-looking documents spread before him. Child Services had issued an emergency order. The medication incident, combined with ongoing concerns, had triggered escalated monitoring, daily check-ins, mandatory psychiatric evaluation for Nice, increased parent education requirements for Mark. The grandmothers had left detailed notes about the 0-day disaster, missed meals, forgotten pickups, homework abandoned. Mark's attempts to follow my schedules had devolved into paralyzed confusion. Those grandmothers coordinating their intel like they're running a spy network, while Mark turns the house into a chemistry experiment gone wrong. The man discovered toxic fumes weren't a cleaning feature the hard way. They'd essentially moved in to prevent complete collapse. I spent the night managing fallout, scheduling psychiatric appointments, responding to child services requirements, comforting traumatized children. Mark sat nearby, defeated and silent, occasionally apologizing for specific failures. The next morning, I returned to work to find my partnerships approved and a compensation increase authorized. The irony wasn't lost on me. Professional success while personal life imploded. My boss congratulated me while expressing concern about my obvious exhaustion. Eunice's psychiatric evaluation. No text revealed severe anxiety requiring immediate treatment. The doctor prescribed medication and intensive therapy. She explained that the accumulated stress had triggered a crisis that would take months to resolve. Mark's advanced parenting classes began that week. The instructor pulled me aside after dropping him off, noting his struggle with basic concepts. She suggested individual counseling to address his deeper issues with responsibility and competence. We established new routines out of necessity. Both grandmothers alternated days. I adjusted my work schedule around appointments. Mark followed rigid checklists for any household task. The kids moved through days with weary exhaustion. The breakthrough came unexpectedly. Mark discovered Chris crying over a school project about family heroes. He'd written about me, but crossed it out, ashamed of our family's reputation. Mark found him revising it to be about a fictional character instead. Something shifted in Mark that night. He spent hours helping Chris rewrite the project, acknowledging how his failures had hurt family. He shared his own struggles honestly, admitting he'd never learned to value domestic work until forced to do it. The next parenting class covered emotional intelligence. Mark returned with revelations about his dismissive attitudes stemming from fear of inadequacy. He'd belittled what he couldn't do rather than learning. The instructor had assigned exercises in validation and appreciation. Slowly, incrementally, Mark began implementing real changes, not the frantic attempts of before, but measured efforts. He started with one task mastered completely before adding another. Breakfast became his reliable contribution. Then school lunches, small victories, child services noted the improvements at their next visit. Mr. McDaniel observed Mark successfully managing morning routines while I prepared for work. She documented his interaction with kids, noting genuine engagement rather than performed competence. The psychiatric support helped on Eunice gradually return to regular classes. Her anxiety remained, but became manageable. She started eating lunch with one understanding friend whose mother had reached out despite community pressure. Chris's teacher reported improvements in his focus. The stability at home, even fragile, allowed him to concentrate on school. He made the basketball team, and Mark attended every practice, learning the sport alongside his son. My work stabilized as home life became predictable. The partnerships I'd secured began generating results. My boss acknowledged my dedication. Despite personal challenges, the promotion I'd earned finally felt secure rather than precarious. Mark's graduation from basic parenting classes felt anticlimactic. He received a certificate that seemed inadequate for the journey, but he genuinely absorbed the lessons, understanding finally what I'd managed invisibly for years. The child services investigation officially closed after 11 months. Ms. McDaniel's final report noted significant improvements and sustained stability. She commended our commitment to change while acknowledging the ongoing challenges we'd faced. That evening, we had a family dinner without crisis. Mark had cooked, nothing fancy, but edible and nutritious. The kids shared their days without tension. I didn't have to manage or direct. It was simply normal. Later, Mark found me paying bills, a task he'd never noticed for. He sat beside me, asking to learn the system I'd developed, not because he had to, but because he finally understood it mattered. I showed him the spreadsheets, the automatic payments, careful budgeting that kept us afloat. He apologized. Again, but differently this time. Not the desperate apologies of crisis, but genuine acknowledgement of years of dismissal. He understood now that the bare minimum was actually the foundation that held everything together. We weren't fixed. Trust remained fragile. The kids still watched him wearily. I still carried most of the mental load, but Mark now contributed deliberately, consistently. He'd learned that competence came from practice, not dismissal. Eunice made the volleyball team the following year. Mark drove her to every practice, learning the sports rules to support her properly. Chris excelled in school with two parents actually present. The family functioned imperfectly, but genuinely. I kept my promotion and built on those partnerships. My career thrived with actual support at home. Mark never again suggested my work was less valuable than his. He'd learned through failure what I'd known all along. The bare minimum wasn't minimal at all. It was everything that made life possible. And finally, no text after near destruction, our family understood that truth. We moved forward scarred but wiser, building something sustainable from the ruins of Mark's hard-learned lesson. The fact that it took a full system crash for him to appreciate the invisible magic of clean socks and packed lunches would be funny if it wasn't so painfully real. Thanks for watching. See you in the next.